Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Tyler's Row by Miss Reed. Diana and Peter are now the owners and landlords of Tyler's Row and don't always get along with their two tenants on either side, but Diana is actually worried about the tenant on one side, Sergeant Burnaby, who is old and in ill health. It was still raining the next morning when Peter went off to school. A long puddle, dimpled with raindrops, lay along the edge of the brick path, and the trunks of the trees were stippled with little rivulets. Still anxious, Diana peered through the hedge at Sergeant Burnaby's doorstep. She was shocked to see 2 full bottles of milk standing there in the rain. This must be the 3rd day the old man had been unable to go outside. At that moment the postman arrived. He called at the soldier's house first, and then came to Diana's door. She inquired if he had seen Sergeant Burnaby. "Come to think of it," said the young man, dripping droplets from his peaked cap over the letters in his hand, "I haven't. He's usually up and about, and now you mention it, yesterday's letter was still stuffed in his letter slit. You reckon he's okay?" "I'm not sure," replied Diana, "but I'm going round immediately. Shall I come too?" "No, you've got your duties to do, many thanks. I'll manage. If need be, I'll telephone for some help." The postman looked a trifle disappointed, Diana thought, at being denied a little drama, but she was sure that the fewer people who visited Sergeant Barnaby, the better. No doubt she would get a hostile reception anyway, but she was willing to take the risk. She shrugged on a mackintosh and splashed her way to the adjoining cottage. The door was shut. She knocked and waited, watching the raindrops slide down the wood and noting that all the windows were securely shut. After a minute or two, she tried the door handle. The door was not locked or bolted, she was thankful to find. She opened it a little way and called. There was no answer. Now she began to feel afraid and wished she had accepted the offer of the postman's company. Suppose the old man lay dead? The house was unnaturally quiet and had the frosty smell of an old house shut up for days without air. She picked up the milk bottles. They rattled together in her shaking hand and seemed to make a terrible din. Taking a deep breath, she entered the living room. The fireplace had a few cold ashes in it. The windows were slightly misted with condensation. A crumpled newspaper lay on the floor by the old man's armchair. It was dated, Diana could see, 3 days earlier. Behind the door were more newspapers and 2 or 3 letters. She picked them up and put them on the table, still listening intently for any sound. "Sergeant Burnaby," she called at the foot of the stairs. There was no reply. She called again, louder now, her heart beginning to pound. Should she return and fetch help? No, she told herself, he might simply be sleeping soundly, and it was obviously sensible to find out first. She mounted the stairs, calling as she went. Both doors at the head of the stairs were shut, but she knew that the old soldier's room was on the right-hand side, his wall adjoining their own house. She rapped on the door and stood listening, head on one side. There was no sound. She rapped again, rather more loudly, and now there was the squeak of bed springs and grunting noises. "Can I come in?" "Who's there?" "Diana Hale. Are you all right?" "What do you want?" The voice was surly, but not unfriendly. Emboldened, Diana pushed open the door. The old man's bristly face peered suspiciously over the bedclothes. The room was stuffy, and the bed looked as though it had been used for 2 or 3 days without being made afresh. "I was rather worried about you," said Diana. "We haven't seen you about, and I wondered if you were ill." "I've been a bit rough," admitted the old man. He looked thinner, and his yellow face sagged. The fierce mustaches were down-bent, giving him an unusually depressed appearance. "Let me get you a drink," said Diana. "What would you like? Hot milk or tea or something stronger?" "I thought I had some tea," said Sergeant Burnaby, looking about vaguely. Diana took the empty cup from his bedside table. It was dry and stained and had obviously been there for a day or two. "I'll make you a fresh cup. When did you drink this?" "Last night, I think. What's today?" Diana told him. He looked disbelieving and slightly affronted. "I come up here Monday night, just after Z-cars. Felt a bit rough with my chest." "I think you've been here ever since," Diana said. He put a hand to his ribs and winced. "Got a sharpish pain here. Better sit up." She shook up the pillows and helped the old fellow upright. A spasm of coughing tore the man, and Diana was alarmed at the violence of the attack. She waited until it had passed, and he leant back upon the pillows, exhausted. "I'll get your drink," she said, "and then I think we must get the doctor to have a look at you." "Don't want no damn doctor messing about with me," wheezed the old man spasmodically. Diana left to make him the tea. She could hear the sergeant's heavy breathing as she waited for the kettle to boil. She found a tin of biscuits and put them on the tray. There seemed to be remarkably little food in the pantry, but she did not like to pry too much. She resolved to bring him some homemade soup and perhaps a boiled egg, if she could manage it. He was grateful for the tea and drank it thirstily. Diana watched his trembling hands anxiously. "Now I'm going to pour you out a second cup, and while you drink it, I'll ask the doctor to call on his rounds. Who do you have?" "Young Barton at Springburn. He's no good, like all of them. I tell you, I don't want nobody. I'll be all right if I rest." Diana said no more. She did not want to agitate him further, but she certainly intended to get help. On her return to the cottage, she rang the surgery and was told that Dr. Barton, though excessively busy, would call about 12. A little before midday, Diana went round again, bearing a light lunch. The old man was dozing, but woke at once and seemed almost pleased to see her. She sat by the window and watched him eat. It would be best, she thought, to let him finish the meal before breaking the news of the doctor's impending visit. When he had finished, she brought him a bowl of warm water, soap, and sponge, spreading the towel which hung from the bed rail across the old man's lap. "That's better," he said, mopping the drops from his chin. "You've been a good neighbor to me this morning." He smiled upon her, and Diana took courage. "You may not think so when I tell you that Dr. Barton's calling." "You ain't rung him," protested Sergeant Burnaby, his face clouding. "I must," replied Diana. "You need an examination. It's the right thing to let your doctor have a look at you." "That's the worst of women," said the old soldier viciously. "Too damn interfering." He tugged crossly at the bedclothes and was smitten with another racking attack of coughing. It was whilst this was in progress that the door opened, and in walked the doctor. Later he came downstairs to where Diana was waiting. "Are you a relative?" "No, just a neighbor. The sergeant is our tenant. He's pretty frail, pleurisy and bronchitis, and his heart's not all it should be. What age is he?" "Late 70s, I believe." The doctor nodded. "Like most of these old people, he's underfed, too. Can't be bothered to cook. All tea and biscuits. I'm sending the ambulance for him." Diana felt startled. She had not imagined that Sergeant Burnaby would need hospital treatment. The old man would be furious. "Can you wait with him until he comes? I've several cases to attend to." "Of course." "Perhaps you could put a few things together for him? Pajamas, soap, that sort of thing?" He went out to his car, and Diana returned upstairs with some trepidation. "Pleased with yourself?" asked Sergeant Burnaby nastily. "Gets me out of the way, don't it?" "Sergeant Burnaby!" protested Diana. Something in her face must have touched the old soldier's heart. All right. Don't start piping your eye. I got enough to put up with without that. Give us a hand with my clothes, gal. If I got to totter to the blasted hospital, I'd better go decent." Chapter 16. Amy's Party. My friend Amy lives in the village of Bent, a few miles on the southern side of Caxley. I can take a roundabout route through the lanes of Fairacre and get there comfortably in half an hour. The hedges were festooned with honeysuckle, the fragile trumpets giving out a wonderful scent in the warm evening air. Here and there a late wild rose starred the greenery, and young fledglings squatted fearlessly among the grit in the road and had to be warned of danger by a toot from one's car horn. The corn was now golden, rustling in the light breeze which fanned the expanse, ruffling it like the wind across the sea. Soon the combines would be out, trundling round and round the acres like so many clumsy prehistoric beasts, while the farmers prayed for fine weather and freedom from mechanical breakdowns. Nettled though I was by Amy's disparaging remarks about my perfectly good black frock, I had to admit that she had seen it a great many times, and perhaps a new one might be a good idea. Consequently, I was attired not in red, but in an elegant affair of bottle green, which I had bought at enormous expense in Caxley's leading stores. The hole which this extravagance had made in my monthly budget was truly horrifying. I comforted myself with the thought that it was an investment, and that I could probably live on eggs, which were plentiful and cheap, and the perpetual spinach which was rioting in my vegetable garden. If the worst came to the worst, I should have to borrow some money from the needlework OXO tin, as I had done before in times of financial stress. Aunt Clara's seed pearls did nothing to enhance my ensemble, I had decided, and had dug a fat silver brooch from Mexico, which looked rather splendid, I thought, after a brisk rubbing with Silvo at the last minute. If I had been richer, I should have bought a stunning pair of shoes to match my frock, but in the circumstances I polished my old black patent ones and was quite content. How nice it is to grow old, I mused as I trundled along between the hedges. 20 years earlier I should have worried about the shoes. Now I didn't care a tinker's cuss that they were old. I really would not care if I were going barefoot, except on Amy's account. There is a limit to eccentricity, even between old friends. There were several cars in the drive when I arrived. I was glad I was not the first, as I so often am. "It looks as though you never had a square meal," Amy scolded once, bursting in on the dot and sniffing the air like a Bisto kid. "I like to be punctual," I replied with dignity. Amy's house was built in the 30s and had a prosperous look about it, with its wide eaves and pretty stonework. It looks across a valley, now golden with corn, toward distant hills to the south. There were several people there whom I had met before, and surprisingly, the Mauns from Fairacre. We greeted each other with unusual enthusiasm, meeting in a foreign part so unexpectedly. "Let me present Mr. Baker," said Amy. "Gerald Baker, Mrs. Maun and her husband, Henry Maun, Miss Reed, all from Fairacre, Gerald, and bursting with knowledge about Aloysius." I don't quite know what I had expected when Amy first told me about Gerald, but I was pleasantly surprised. Somehow one does not expect a writer to look normal. If male, one half expects a beard or a mop of hair, or both, allied to a certain sallowness of complexion, burning midnight oil, and either advanced emaciation because of failure to sell his work, or too much flesh because of unusual success. Gerald Baker was neither thin nor fat, clean-shaven, with tidy fair hair and an air of cheerful competence. He would have made a reassuring dentist or a reliable headmaster of a prep school. All three of us explained hastily that we knew very little about the poet he was interested in, but I told him about Mr. Willett's remarks, and he was eager to meet him. "Aloysius sounds rather a trial," he said. "He's the 6th poet I've tackled so far, and to be frank, they're all proving to be hopelessly domestical." "But surely it's their work you're considering?" said Mrs. Maun. "Yes, but the men too. I've come to the conclusion that life with a poet, and the more minor the worse, must have been uncommonly depressing for the family." At this moment Vanessa was brought up to meet the great man. She looked tidier than usual, but still pale and unhappy. We drifted away as the movement of guests carried us, and let them converse. Later, some of us wandered into the garden. Amy is splendidly up to the minute with her garden. There are lots of shrubs and roses and more foliage than flowers in her herbaceous border. As she is a keen flower arranger, the place fairly bristles with hostas and dogwood and lots of things with green flowers or catkins which are difficult to distinguish from the surrounding foliage. A beautiful old lime tree scented the air, and I made a private bet with myself that not a branch entered Amy's house without being first denuded of its leaves. Did she still, I wonder, pop the young leaves against her mouth with a satisfying report? She had been a notable leaf popper at college. Probably she had put such childish things behind her. Whilst I mused, swigging my sherry in the glass, Gerald came to join me, and we went to sit on an elegant white wrought-iron seat which was much more comfortable than it looked. "It's nice to be in the fresh air," he confessed. "Why do even the politest cocktail parties get so hot and noisy?" I took this to be a rhetorical question, and only smiled in reply. "Do you know Vanessa well?" was his next question. "Not very. She seems such a charming child, but sad. Crossed in love, I suppose. One always is at that age." I told him about the 4 times married husband. "But she looks better than she did," I assured him. "Amy tells me she's getting over it." "What a blessing it is to grow out of one's first youth," said Gerald. "Everything matters so terribly, so much to learn, too many mistakes to make. That line from Gigi, 'Methuselah is my patron saint,' that strikes a chord with me." "Me too," I told him. "I was thinking on much the same lines as I drove over here this evening." "Vanessa's staying here for a few days," said Gerald. "I wonder if she'd bring her aunt to lunch with me in Caxley. Do you think she'd find it boring?" "Of course not. Ask her anyway, and I'd say she'd be honored." "Awful to be young," he repeated, gazing across the valley. "So vulnerable at that age, exposed to every blow, helpless, like a winkle without a shell," I suggested, as he sought for words. He threw back his head and roared with laughter. "Exactly. I was searching for a much more poetic simile, but that hits the nail on the head." "We must go back and mingle," I said. "We've had our quota of fresh air." "I'll catch Amy now before I go," said Gerald, "and ask about Vanessa." "Good luck," I said. "And if Amy can't come, I shouldn't let it worry you. After all, Vanessa is now legally an adult." As the guests drifted away, Amy took me to one side. "Stop and help us eat up the bits, darling," she begged. "You won't have to wash up. Mrs. Thingummy's come to help." "You misjudge me," I said. "I didn't think you wanted me simply to stay and do a bit of charring. And yes, please, I'd love to eat my way through those smoked salmon fripperies, not to mention the rolled asparagus chips." "It is useful to have a greedy friend," exclaimed Amy. Later, over enormous cups of coffee, Vanessa and I congratulated Amy on the success of the party. "If only poor old James could have been here," she said. "He was called away this afternoon to some wretched meeting in Leicester." "Has he met Gerald Baker?" "Yes, indeed. James introduced me to him. By the way, how did you get on?" "Very well. I like his no-nonsense manner. He's not a bit as I imagined him." "He's invited Vanessa and me to lunch while he's in Caxley," Amy said. "Has he asked you by any chance?" "Alas, no. Any hopes you had of matchmaking, Amy, are in vain. Nice though he is, I doubt if Gerald is really interested in matrimony." Vanessa put her cup down with a crash and sprang to her feet. "How I do hate to hear people picked over! I thought Mr. Baker was the kindest, most honest, sweetest person I've met for a long time, not a bit like most grown-ups." She stalked to the door, slammed it behind her, and left us gazing at each other. "Well," I exclaimed. Amy shrugged her shoulders and reached for another cigarette. "The young," she said indulgently, "are excessively trying." Well, whether or not we need to try with Vanessa next time remains to be seen.